Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and we'll jump right in here. So the topic is China and the U.S. in AI, and so we have a great couple of speakers here. And so, how would you compare the strengths and weaknesses of China versus the U.S. in AI? Can one say that one country is more advanced in certain aspects than another? Helen?
Okay, I think most people know U.S. is quite advanced in terms of R&D, research development, fundamental research in AI. China may have an edge in terms of AI application, due to the advantage in terms of data, the amount of data available, and the less regulation on the data usage.
And is that going to, less regulation on the data usage so they can collect a lot more data for the machine learning? Do you think, is there going to be like a backlash against that? Are Chinese getting a little more sensitive about that issue?
They are. I would say not exactly backlash. There was some adjustment. I would say that gradually they will have some kind of regulation catching up. So, but the advantage is still there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would say the access to data is obviously a very important one for machine learning and training. But I think what's kind of underlooked here is more of, I would call it the spirit and the willingness to explore and experiment. And I think just do it and then plan, do it and make a strategy, see what happens. That's much stronger, I think, in China. And I think that's going to help them find new uses and make headway in new applications of AI, much more so than I think in the US.
So that's interesting. That's a little bit counterintuitive in the sense that I think a lot of people think of the US as being, very entrepreneurial and very open to new ideas, but you're saying that in China they're more willing to experiment, more willing to push the envelope?
Yeah, Chinese companies don't have a strategy, and so that helps a lot. You can do new things because you don't have this constraint. Well, our strategy is this, and so it has to stay in this box. And that's also, they're more willing to go beyond their initial thing to expand. Hence, you have WeChat going all over a whole ecosystem of businesses, whereas Facebook, they're much more compartmentalized and they stay there. And I think that's another implication of that willingness to go beyond, experiment, try things, that I think is much stronger and will have a long-term big impact, already has an impact in contrasting the US and China's ecosystems.
I think that's largely true. A couple of factors here. One is competition. So China has much fierce competition. When you're facing competition, you better move fast, otherwise you won't survive. I think it has that mentality to tie to it.
Mm-hmm. So it's more competitive. So like a company like WeChat faces more competition than a company like Facebook, for example?
That's right. I think Tencent CEO Pony Ma once had some saying like, in US, the ideas matter so much more because once you have idea, you have significant competitive advantage. In China, that's not exactly the case. When you have idea, maybe it's, 1 week from there, it's going to have a lot of similar companies doing similar stuff. So you better move fast.
Yeah, that thing of execution and executing in two senses, not just executing the business, but also executing your opponent. I think that spirit is really strong. It's really a vicious place to be an entrepreneur. Yeah.
Interesting. And how does the sort of government regulation side play into that? Because I think on the one hand, you have a very freewheeling internet ecosystem, as you refer to. On the other hand, the government is also kind of committed to, some pretty strict rules and laws about and principles about purifying the internet and this sort of stuff. So how does that play in when it comes to AI experimentation?
Well, I think actually we kind of shift to fintech. I think that's one of the biggest reasons that fintech was able to take off so quickly in China, is because there were no regulations, or the banking regulation. Two things: banking regulations that would affect them were not so developed, and so they had a lot more free space to play in. Now, there were some problems that emerged, and that's when the regulation came. But it was experimentation followed by regulation, rather than regulation first and then let the entrepreneurs try something. And so I think that was a very important role there. To
shift gears slightly, we tend to talk about AI as a sort of general term, and it refers to actually some very different technologies. And I think that what most people mean by AI these days is machine learning in particular, and that's where the availability of data comes into play. Are there other kinds of AI where the kind of strengths and weaknesses of the two countries might be a little different?
I would say the majority of the development is circled around the deep learning. So that's where you see the advancement of the algorithm, you see the AlphaGo. Now there's development, of course, rely on, now circled around whether how much dependency you're going to rely on data. So you're going to, with also DeepMind develop the AlphaGo Zero that has almost no dependency on the amount of the data. So that, I think, is one of the directions worth to watch.
Thanks. So how does the ecosystem differ in terms of the kind of institutions and the players that are supporting AI? Is the most advanced development, is it in the universities? Is it in companies? Is it government research laboratories? Where is kind of the heat around AI development in China and the US respectively?
I guess one term that's used is whole of something. I think that in China, there's definitely a whole of society, including government, including private companies, including universities, and that they're going to be, one, all kind of going in the same direction, and two, allowing or encouraging much more interaction between those sectors, the government, private sectors, academia. Whereas I think in the US, we have a whole of government approach to it. They're trying to organize the government and coordinate that. But then that's separate, largely separate from the, I would call it whole of company. So every company is trying to figure out what it's going to be doing. And I think there's a lot less room or normal thinking about interactions between them. I mean, the example of Google employees walking out because they didn't want Google to be working with the military is something that would never happen in China. There's much more interactions there between sectors.
So more interaction, more interrelationship between companies, governments, and universities. Would that be part of it as well?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I would say the leading research, frontier research, they're most driven by tech company, their R&D center, combined with academic research. The government does play a role. It's probably a bigger role played by China government in the AI push. U.S. government probably play a lesser role in comparable terms.
So is there, I mean, we certainly think about companies like Google and institutions like Tsinghua or Stanford as being leading edge. I mean, are there kind of companies, institutions that, I mean, if you would each maybe pick one, what's a company or institution that maybe is doing some very sophisticated work in AI that people have not heard about so much, that's a little bit more under the radar?
Maybe not exactly on the radar, but because they're just so much advanced, maybe they're not sharing everything yet. As I will be saying, DeepMind, which is owned by Google now. They're doing a very frontier AI research, and in terms of different areas, applications, healthcare, and other areas, game theory. So I think to the public, to a certain degree, maybe know something they share, but not everything.
Mm-hmm.
I think obviously it's in China, it would be obviously the Tencents and Alibabas and Baidu's. They're putting huge resources into the AI. But I think, and the government itself is trying to create, if you want to call it an AI research, champion. How well that's going to work when it's 30 kilometers away from Beijing is not clear. And so I think instead it's going to be more in some of the existing organizations. For example, Tsinghua with its new AI institute. They're going to be able to draw on Tsinghua's resources, its network of people, to really build that up. And I think that's where that might be also a slight difference from a typical university in the United States. That's not going to be accessing and having people have dual identities. One is an employee or working somewhere, and another one as a member of the AI Institute. And so they're going to have a much bigger group of people working on that and collaborating than maybe you would have in the same kind of organization in a university in the United States.
Yeah, there's a good example is MIT. So MIT just formed, I think last month, with a couple $1 billion grant, and formed a new AI college. So the intention here is really to draw talent, interdiscipline, from all various backgrounds, in terms of, let's say, psychology or philosophy, besides computer science. So I think that will be a trend going forward. You're going to see more and more of interdisciplinary research related to AI and development.
So that relates to my next question: is where are the most important applications of AI today? I mean, there's some obvious ones, voice assistants and some consumer-facing things, but where do you think these technologies are most relevant in the short term?
So I think one, we probably all experience facial recognition, right? That's in security. I think probably already in all the airport, traffic control. So a banking system, I think that's already pretty much everywhere.
For me, I think it's, especially in the context of China, there's huge potential and expectations that it's going to make a big difference in education and healthcare, and then in more kind of even hardware-based applications, elderly care. Because that's a huge problem. I think the Chinese government, that's one of the those 3 of the 7 key areas that the Chinese government wants AI to really move China head on.
So how is AI relevant to, say, elder care? I mean,
because everyone might have seen this on the news a few days ago that Tsinghua has this talking news anchor. So I got some calls from news anchors saying, well, what do you think? Are our jobs in danger? And it's going to be quite a while, because really that was simply something that Disneyland has been doing for about 40, 50 years, the mechatronics of the face moves when the voice comes out. If he had been creating the news, writing the news, that would have been impressive. But if you add an AI kind of interface, just like you have your chatbots and things with your banking services, if you were to add that kind of interaction and the human interface with robots for elderly care, that could be a game changer.
Yeah, we look at companies doing what we call the virtual human. So for healthcare, for elderly care, you can have a virtual nurse. It looks like a human, it talks like a human. So for elderly care, the tough thing is you're going to need someone need constant attention, right? So for the nurse, then we're going to be pretty shortage of nurse. So for a virtual human, virtual nurse, it can be available 24 hours on call, and can be anytime when you need some assistance, it will be there. So that's one of the things we see happening.
And how far away are we from something like that? I mean, I tend to be a little bit of a skeptic on some of the short-term promises. So my gut would say, that's kind of 10, 15 years out, right, before there's really a, human-like AI nurse that can really help.
It's sooner than you thought.
Sorry?
It's sooner than you thought.
Shorter than I think, you think?
It's sooner. It's already happening. So one company we look at is called Soul Machines. It's out of actually New Zealand. So they're working with one of the applications on healthcare. Right now, they're already working with a customer service company like Autodesk. So for consumer on call, for the customer service on call, they have this virtual customer service person. It's very much look like real. And one next area is getting into healthcare. It's happening right now.
And how about in this financial technology conference? What are some of the financial services, AI-driven financial services that might really matter in the short term?
So exactly for the same line, for the virtual human service, we're going to have robo-advisors. So today, for all the investment bank, the model that works, they go to all the top schools to hire the smart kid, like out of Harvard, out of Wharton Business School, to look at the charts, to do analysis, right? So now we're going to see with larger banks, investment bank like JP Morgan, they're going to look into more and more robo-advisors, basically bots that look like a human or maybe just a computer. So that, I think, is happening too.
I think the idea of using this to predict, for example, defaults, I think applying many more variables and larger data to that, and then to evaluate a particular case, I think that's going to be one of the biggest applications customer facing. But I think internally, there are going to be even more applications, maybe having a bigger impact in a financial sense on operations by making them more efficient internally. And I think that's where a big impact that we don't hear too much about, because we're not directly seeing it, but the.
That's right. That's right. So we do come into clients like that. They're constantly looking for AI fintech startups to acquire. So a big part of that is doing data management. So how do you capture value out of the huge amount of data which the banks, financial service firm accumulate? What kind of new service, personalized service? The other will be cool for them own data management efficiency, process automation. That's happening too.
Thanks. So we have I'm going to go to a couple of audience questions. So this is one that I actually had on my list, but is particularly well phrased here. I think it's supposed to come up on the screen. I don't know. But anyway, so the question is, with the recent trade tensions between the two companies, how would this affect AI development and knowledge sharing between the two countries?
Yes, we had a great pre-discussion about this because this is something that me working in a university, I feel very, I like the idea of an invisible college where, people can collaborate or encouraged to collaborate across university, across national boundaries. And that's still, I think, very strong. But then, we look at relationships between researchers presenting at the top conferences, lots of, cross-border interactions. The US and China are two key nodes, and then about 8 other countries are key secondary collaborators if you do a network analysis of it. So that's is very strong, and hopefully that will continue. That's in every country's interest to have this collaboration. Now the governments might have, and particular companies might have, different views about this protection. The governments in particular might see this much more from a competition point of view, both economic, military, and somehow knowledge leadership. So that we're waiting to see how that's going to play out.
I will look at it from the problem-solving perspective. So what is AI? It's basically empowering technology as a tool, allowing us to solving problems better. So from that angle, I will see there are plenty of problems, challenges that we're facing. We can use AI to better solve the problem, like healthcare problem, right? Like a traffic jam, and transportation problem. So with that, I see the collaboration will have to continue. It's for public good. In terms of competition, I think we can look at this. The AI technology is different than when we talk about the nuclear war or other things. So it's more of zero sum. But here, I can see it's a win-win situation for all the players when you deploy AI. So I will see in terms for using AI for public good, this will be continued collaboration as we would expect.
Well, so to push that point a little bit, I mean, well, I take the point about collaboration and public goods, but AI has many military applications. If you're a government and you consider another great power to be competition and potentially a threat, you might say, well, that kind of collaboration in AI is not really in the national interest. And I mean, do any of the people that you work with worry about that problem on the near horizon?
Not right now. I don't think that there's been any kind of real big test cases, very big cases of this happening. I think in the US it would be extremely difficult to do it just because of the legal system and the norms. And in China, I don't see it as being, it hasn't come out yet if it's happened. But I don't know how that would be handled very differently by the two different governments if they did feel that way.
I think this is getting to relate to the AI governance issue. There will be risks, but I think now the global community is going to coming together to more. I have been seeing more discussions in the global AI forums in terms of the ethics, AI and ethics, or how can we come together to get smarter on AI governance for a safe world. I think that conversation has started and it will continue.
So to go to that point about AI ethics, this is a very live debate in the US, certainly. Do you see that as an area of collaboration, or do the two countries have kind of different approaches, different ways of thinking about these ethical issues?
Also, there's more room for collaboration. There's a certain degree of competition for sure, that's natural. And for business, for market share, But I would say for problem-solving perspective, the plenty of challenges we're facing will require collaboration.
I think right there's one fundamental difference, I think, in the relative weighting or priority of, I think, the individual rights versus the a group or society's rights or well-being, the benefits. And I think in the US you might say that it's much more driven by the individual rights, and as long as it doesn't affect that, okay, it can be done. Whereas I think in China there's much more consideration, what's the overall group cost or benefit, and weighing that against the individual level. So I think there's a different way of prioritizing the relative.
So China prioritizing the kind of social benefits and risks as opposed to individual benefits and risks.
Hence, I mean, and that's why the surveillance, the facial recognition, most Chinese don't think that's a bad thing because they're catching criminals. So even if their picture and data is being gathered and monitored, well, if it catches some criminals, how can I complain about that?
Well, yeah, and that's a question. I mean, I've noticed that myself in terms of the attitudes and how people react to these things. But I wonder if that's a kind of a short-term thing in a sense. I mean, so it seems good because they're catching criminals, but then when you start to really understand the kind of depth and detail of the data collection, it starts to make you feel a little uncomfortable. I mean, do you think there's going to be a little bit of a kind of revisiting of some of those attitudes in China?
I would think so at some point, yeah. I think that's why we talk about AI governance. So we're hoping the global AI community will have establish certain common rules to follow on how the AI technology are being used. I can understand what Stephen's talking about in China, people are probably less concerned about using the facial recognition data because I do feel that I was in a high-speed train in Shanghai. When you are in that kind of public environment, it doesn't actually make you feel better. You think it's a pretty safe environment when you have in a crowd and you have a certain safe protection place. But in the long term, we do need certain guidelines to say to avoid data are being abused to a certain degree of usage.
Right, I think that, and this is a danger that both WeChat, Tencent, and Alibaba are in when they are developing social credit rating systems based on their customers' purchasing data, for example. And if you buy something that seems to lower your credit rating, and people find that out later when they go to get a mortgage, that they have to pay a little bit more because they bought this stuff on Taobao, that there might be some problems.
Or Pinduoduo.
Or Pinduoduo, and so I think that's where no one knows that hasn't affected anyone yet, but there's a potential for that to affect them in the future.
Right. Not sure what that's about exactly. Okay, well, I'm going to go to another question here, which is a sort of a different way of asking the same kind of question that we have here, which is, can you identify particular cultural differences that affect the way the two countries approach AI?
I come from a management perspective on this, more than technology one. And there's a fundamental difference in the way companies in China, especially knowledge-based companies in China, versus in the US are managed, how the internal, down to the team group level. China is much more top-down. You have one smart guy, and then he kind of directs what everyone does. It's kind of a one-way thing. Whereas in the US, you hire smart people because they can contribute. There's much more of a collaboration feeling, even if there's a hierarchy, more people cooperating. So I think there's a huge difference in that, how it's done kind of internally, how the work is actually done and managed.
And will that lead to kind of different kinds of applications? Like, does one type of approach, this is maybe a little abstract to answer, but does one type of approach particularly effective in certain types of applications?
In general, the more different technologies are going to be involved, you need more expertise, more diverse expertise. And that would be hard for one person to have significantly diverse knowledge bases to draw on. And so that's why cross-functional development is really poor in China, because they just don't know how to work horizontally. They're used to working, someone directing what's being done. Hence, you know, Baidu is really worried when Andrew Ng leaves, because he was probably very critical in delimiting what people were doing and who's going to be able to take that place. It's a very critical role, and there are not that many people who can do it well and broadly.
I would look at it from perspective of the speed of the technology adoption will be very different because the cultural differences, more tolerance in terms of data privacy issue or less regulation that, it will affect the speed of AI adoption a lot. One good example is in autonomous driving, right? When we talk about autonomous driving in Silicon Valley, we do technology investment. We look at the volume adoption, probably we're thinking like 7 to 10 years away. But in China, I think it's very much likely it's 3 to 5 years away because just the amount of the data are being collected, the way it's deployed. So in terms of that, I would say not a huge difference in terms of types of application, but in terms of speed of AI adoption.
Yeah, the deployment difference will be huge because
that's right.
you have fewer people who need to decide also.
That's right,
So
that's right. So
the
deployment the rate is be very different.
And are there, and this is a kind of follow-up question from the audience here, are there limits to that data advantage?
One thing, the data advantage is the size of the data. I think that will continue. But I would think the regulation will catch up at some point to avoid abuse of use of the data. But I think the size, sheer size of that advantage will continue.
Mm-hmm. And I think already, there's starting to be a split between the government's already in China's putting privacy regulations that I think that the government's still going to maintain ability to access it, but it's probably going to put much more constraints on private companies in accessing it or using it or abusing it.
That's right.
So new constraints coming on private sector use of data, and that maybe levels the playing field in some ways.
To a certain degree, I
yeah, okay. Is it even kind of relevant to talk about this as a competition, like that one country is going to kind of win the competition for AI, and if so, who's going to win? Or is that kind of the wrong question?
I would say it probably is not the right angle to look at this. It's kind of harder to be a competition because for the AI to be really human level AI, or we call say human-like AI, there are plenty of challenges, technology challenges ahead. So I would say we look from a broader perspective in terms of how technology advancement will enable human-level AI. That will for sure require collaboration.
Mm-hmm. I think that depends on who you ask, and you can have the militaries clearly have it's very much a view of competition, but I think that if you're in education or healthcare, I think there's much more of a feeling of collaboration. We can apply this, and there's much more of promoting a social good, a benefit. So I think depending on who you ask, it is truly a competition, and a very important one, or it's truly, collaboration is the way to go because we all benefit more from it. So I don't think there's an absolute correct view because each of those are valid.
It really depends from which perspective you're looking at, yeah.
Right, okay. And we're almost out of time here, but one more thing I wanted to ask. So we talked a few times about data collection and China having an advantage there. That applies specifically to kind of deep machine learning, deep learning types of AI technology, which is really mostly what's going on at the moment. Are there kind of fundamental limits to that, to machine learning, like problems that it can't solve and that will require a kind of a whole different set of technologies? Because ultimately, machine learning is learning from the past, right? It's looking at data about things that have already happened, and so that seems like it imposes certain kinds of constraints.
That's a great question, actually. For our technology investment, we look into frontier research, what's happening, let's say for computational neuroscience lab, right? When we talk about the AI today, sometimes, when you see AI hypes everywhere, you might give us a wrong perception. We think AI is already at a really human-like level, but it's not. So it's good as in terms of specific task, like facial recognition, voice computing, But in terms of overall intelligence level, it's far from where we are today as a human. So there's still a long way to go. So when we talk about the capability of cognition, right? Not just recognition of certain features, that's still a long way to go. So one way to look at it is how can we make AI chips to be closer to our brain. So there's a number. So our brain, we have neurons, is close to, I think it's close to over 85 billion neurons in our brain. So chips today can do is far from the limit of what we can do in the brain. So that's why some breakthrough areas we're looking at is like neuromorphic chips, which can approach to the level of neurons in our brain. The other is the computational neuroscience to better understand how our neurons tied to our behaviors, tied to our ability to for cognition or for basic, understand the emotion or how we draw the common sense judgment or decision making. That still have a long way to go.
Yeah, I'll kind of build on that. The breakthrough for deep learning was in a paper published in 1986. So finally, the hardware and chips are catching up, but we're exploiting a knowledge system, the AI part, the knowledge system part of AI, that's 30 plus years old. And so I think, and even the guy who started that, he says this is not going to be the answer for what we call general artificial intelligence, the real thinking. And then so you'd have to go into the labs now and see who's banging their head against a wall, not making progress, because that's what's probably going to be the source of the breakthrough to that next level. It won't be an extension of deep learning as we know it now.
Right, right. Yeah. All right, great. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much for a great panel. Thank you, everyone.